Okay, what about if we start off and other people can catch us up as they do? So hello everyone and welcome to June's Tea Break. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and for the purposes of description, I'm a blonde-haired male wearing a white male wearing a black t-shirt, looking much more fresh-faced than I did 10 minutes ago because I suddenly realised I was looking very ashamed. So now I'm all spruced up. So today we're talking about reviews and recommendations, particularly in terms of online recommendations. And I'm joined by my colleague Alec Ward. So if you want to just say a quick hello and do an intro.
Hi everyone, lovely to meet you all. I'm Alec, and for a quick description, I'm a white male in my early 30s, dark brown hair, a beard, glasses, and a blue polo. And I'm a consultant lead for digital content and skills at the Audience Agency.
Thanks a lot, Alec. We're going to start off talking a bit about different audience spectrum groups' use of social media, and then about their kind of attitudes to recommendations of things to do in that local area online, and what sorts of things they trust to a greater or lesser extent. So we will do that for a bit. Alex will do a response. We'll have a bit of Q&A at the end. So usual format. So I'll just put my phone where I can see I'm not talking for too long, and off we go. So we've all engaged with the social media. We asked within the Cultural Participation Monitor, our big nationally representative survey. So the one from this is the one from March still. We asked people which of the following social media sites or social media channels do you use regularly? And we've asked this, or something equivalent to it. We asked a slightly more restricted question back in wave 1 of the Cultural Participation Monitor in October 2022. No, 2020, sorry, time flies. But that one was about which do you post regularly to, not for work. This we just said, well, which of these do you use regularly? So we've got slightly higher results. So we've not compared them like to like. But what we can see in general is, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most popular social media channels that we all know about. Our results do thankfully match that kind of overall picture. So loads of people using WhatsApp, Facebook, shortly closely followed up by YouTube, and then lower down the list, Instagram is a bit higher than other things, TikTok and Twitter a little bit further back, and then Pinterest at the bottom. These are actually scaled, so you can kind of see the size of the gaps between them. But essentially, that's the kind of overall picture we're seeing, ranging from WhatsApp 71% at the top, Pinterest at 17% at the bottom, which is nice and symmetrical. Megan just made a note that we will share slides. We will indeed. And we'll have those slides with alt text on them for those who would like that to be able to sort of get a clearer sense of what we're saying. There's also captions available at the bottom. So if that's the overall picture, the question is, how does it differ for different types of people? Because of course, if we're putting stuff on particular channels, we need to know who it's most relevant to. And here we can see the different audience spectrum groups ranged from typically most engaged in arts and culture on the left to typically least engaged on the right. And indeed, if I just put color shading in behind, that will show you the highest engaged groups. In the orange background, there's 3 there: multiculturals, mutual and culture buffs, experience seekers. Then we've got 3 middle engaged groups in the yellow and 4 lower engaged groups in the blue. Many more details about all of these segments available via our website. I'll mention a few things as we go through. But the thing that really stands out, so what this is showing is that a few segments have higher than average use of social media, pretty much across the board for most channels. If they're above, they tend to be above for everything. And then there's a few segments that tend to be below, particularly 2 segments. So community and culture buffs are lower for everything, pretty much, and home and heritage are lower for everything, and to an even greater extent. So those are the ones who are least engaged, perhaps unsurprisingly, because they tend to be older and more traditional. The groups that are most engaged tend to be metroculturals and experience seekers of the high engaged groups. So both kind of urban, often university educated groups, and then a couple of the lower engaged groups, frontline families, kaleidoscope creativity. Again, often quite city based, but also relatively younger on average profile. So perhaps no great surprise that you end up with seeing those groups really sort of sticking in terms of their relative levels of use. What gets more interesting though, and this is where I need to explain what the scale is really doing, is to see which types of social media they're relatively more or less likely to use. So what the scale is showing is that anything that's at 100 is in line with the average. So it's in line with the figures that are on the left-hand side there. So for example, 69% of people use YouTube. And so anyone that is about 100 for that, so up our street is pretty close to that. That means that their figure will be about that. But if it's substantially above that, it will suggest it's higher. If it's below that, it will be lower. And those indices give you an indication of just quite how much it varies from that average figure. And what sticks out is that each of those, well, certainly each of the three most engaged online groups have a particular social media platform that they're most engaged with. So for metroculturals, they really don't use Facebook compared to the typical levels. They're the furthest below on that one. They're above for everything else, but particularly for Twitter. So given that tends to be kind of sort of metrocultural, London-based often, professionals, so they're kind of, it's all about that kind of social media is kind of where the world is kind of thing, and what's the conversation, I guess. Experience seekers particularly high for Instagram and Pinterest, particularly Pinterest, albeit of course they're higher than average for those, but actually because Pinterest is lower than all of the others, it's still lower in their actual mix of consumption. But nonetheless, if anyone's using Pinterest, it's them. But then finally, kaleidoscope creativity they're high for almost everything, not so much Facebook, but they are particularly high for TikTok. So that kind of probably figures that a couple of those lower engaged groups, actually, frontline families as well, relatively high for TikTok. The difference is kaleidoscope creativity are quite high for a few other things as well. So I guess what we're seeing on average is that different segments have different channels they're particularly engaged with, which might be useful if you're thinking about where to put messaging or who you're targeting if you're using a certain route. So if that's an overview, the next bit, if you like, if you got this tea break on DVD, imagine, this would be the kind of director's cut bit. So we're going to skip past it, but you can rest assured that there is the longer version, which contains even more stuff that you maybe didn't make the cut in it. So I will just glide past this, apart from to flag the absolute headline concepts in it. So if we look at who's following cultural organizations, we see it's pretty much those same groups we just talked about: metroculturals, experience seekers, kaleidoscope creativity, particularly, and who comes across stuff they don't necessarily plan to, but find out about things to do. Same segments, and it's the flip side when it comes to who search for stuff. It's the same people, and indeed who find stuff, even if they're not searching, it's the same people. But it's the flip side if you people that say they don't really find social that useful. So again, it's reinforcing this idea that certain segments, it's not really a priority, other ones very much is. But of course, which platforms depends on what I've just been saying about the distinction between the different groups. But you can look at that in great much more detail in the director's cut version when we send it to you. In the meantime, let's get on to the meat of what we're talking about, which is people's attitudes to reviews and recommendations and how that varies for different types of people. So what we asked people is a little bank of questions about to what extent do you agree with the following statements, and the statements are about I find this a useful source for finding things to do locally, essentially, for each of the different options. And here's what we saw. So we asked people about a range of different sources. So these are the condensed versions of the names, but essentially we said online reviews written by professionals, professional online reviews, for example, newspaper and magazine websites, online review sites, for example, TripAdvisor, where it's the public that are putting reviews on, whether social media people you know, or social media other people, or messages direct from cultural organisations. And to what extent do you trust these as a guide to things you might like to see it do? So you can see here, similar scaling going on the left-hand side. Online reviews from the general public is coming out highest, which I think I probably would have expected, but there's part of me that still feels that's a bit of a surprise, in the sense that it's leapfrogging curated or kind of editorialized sources, but people are trusting those most on average. And we'll come into exactly who does and doesn't in a sec. Professional reviews is still relatively high, so 60%, not 66, but it's still quite a lot of people strongly agreeing in terms of those. There's a big difference between people you know and people you don't know on social media, of course, but still there's still a fair proportion, almost 4 in 10 of people saying actually they find just people in general just saying stuff online is still kind of helpful to find something on to do. And cultural organisations have quite a high degree of trust as well. And I think I might have wondered whether that would be a bit lower relative to the others, on the basis that people would assume that it was potentially biased. But actually people are saying they find it helpful. So there's not that much difference between those top 4. You can see they're all quite compact together. Bit of a drop off towards other social, but nonetheless, that's the kind of the top line. But of course, we want to delve a little bit deeper than that. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into 2 pairs of these to look at how they relate to each other. So to start off with, we'll look at the 2 review ones. So do people trust online reviews by the public, online reviews by professionals? And what we tend to see is that it seems like these go, broadly speaking, hand in hand. So segments either trust both more or both less. Generally speaking, it's not a trade-off between one or the other. People aren't saying I trust professionals, not online reviews so much in most cases. So you can see here for the lower engaged groups, generally speaking, the older groups trust both less, the younger groups trust both more, but they're sort of quite clustered. And when you drop in the middle engaged groups, it forms this really neat line of correlation between the 2. So home and heritage, we've seen they're really low engaged in social media. They're score quite low on lots of these different factors. They don't really trust reviews or the public reviews either to a great extent. The middle engaged groups, the ones with more families, are somewhere in the middle of that existing pattern. So you end up with quite a neat little lineup of all of these sort of spreading up into the right. And then we get to the high engaged groups, who mostly break the trend. And these are the ones I think are probably most interesting in this context. So our experience seekers are kind of young, university educated often, edge of cities, quite culturally engaged, lots of different things, quite sort of a tendency maybe to try more contemporary things. That's their kind of positioning. We saw they're really highly engaged in social media, particularly we saw Pinterest and Instagram, and they come out same trend, but even further up into the right. So they're just very online, basically. But the 2 interesting exceptions, metroculturals and community and culturals. So these are groups who are the 2 most highly engaged in traditional arts and culture. So you would expect them to be really highly interested. We saw that one of them was very engaged in terms of social metroculturals, whereas the other one wasn't. And we do see a little bit of a split out between them in the same sort of way that would fit in the pattern that everyone else is following, that the more engaged you are, the more you trust stuff online. But both of them are much more likely to trust professional reviewers than the general public, which is not true of any other segment. So all of the others are kind of the other side of that line. So what we're seeing is that when people are super engaged or belonging to groups that are super engaged, they're much more likely to be interested in professional reviewers. Everyone else is like, oh no, it's all about us, the general public, and what we think. So when you're thinking about who you're prioritizing in terms of PR activity and press and access and communication, etc., the ones who, the broadsheet reviewers, etc., are going to be appealing much more to the existing highly engaged core audience, whereas stuff that goes out more to bloggers and social media sites and sort of, a much wider public is likely to have a bit more penetration in terms of those other areas. And also means that if you're looking at kind of maintaining your presence or encouraging people to fill out reviews and support you on things like TripAdvisor or Trustpilot or Yelp or whatever, that's particularly helping that kind of wider and often younger audience profile. So that I thought was quite an interesting kind of split in terms of those two groups behaving really quite differently, particularly in the context that one of those is also behaving socially quite differently as opposed to the other being not so keen on social media. Then, if we look at the social media, whether you trust people you know or other people, we see a sort of broadly similar thing in that there's much less need of a correlation between the two. People tend to say, yes, I trust stuff I see online, or no, I don't trust stuff I see online. But again, it's the same three groups in the top right-hand corner who are much more likely to be trusting of online stuff in general. And then again, a couple of the older groups more likely to be inclined to trust people they know rather than people in general. So community and culture buffs, and in this case, dormitory dependables. Home heritage still probably on the bottom left-hand corner, older, more traditional, more rural, more maybe less swayed by some of the sort of stuff that's going on digitally. But metrocultural is much nearer the middle of the pack. One thing I think is quite interesting is if you look at where the average of these will actually sit. So we've got social other is 38%, social known is 57%. So if you trace those together, you pretty much land on where the trips and treats are. They're in the middle. Not surprising, they're kind of quotes middle Britain kind of group. But for supported communities relative to that average, they're more likely to trust other people than they are to trust people they know, relatively speaking. So I guess what we've got here is a group that doesn't tend to be super culturally engaged. And so maybe they're sort of saying, well, actually, the recommendations are coming from out there more generally. Maybe I'm finding out about stuff I wouldn't otherwise hear about. So it could be that there's about out to network kind of effect going on there, potentially. So there we are. One other little bit I wanted to zoom in on before moving along is that we've seen all these different, some of these differences seem to be related to age. And so I thought I'd actually just pull out how they change by age profile, just to highlight a couple of things. So to make it legible, I've not copied all the colours across onto the right-hand side, but hopefully the dots and dashes make it clear which is what. But what you can see is that broadly speaking, you can divide the age range into three large areas. So the age categories up to 35 to 44, most of these categories are pretty flat. So it's relatively higher, but they're fairly sort of straight lines-ish. Maybe people trusting other people they don't know on social media does tail off a little bit faster than the others, but most of them are holding up pretty much until you get to that kind of mid-40s age group. Then for the next, next 20 years, you've got quite a fairly steepish decline in terms of all of these channels, really. Less so professional reviews, but all of them are dropping down, and then it stays pretty flat once you get past 65. But obviously, having settled at a bit of a lower level. So that's the overall picture, a long and high, down, a long and low. There are some exceptions within that, and professional reviews, which start off relatively lower in the mix amongst the youngest age groups, end up as the single most influential or the single most trusted source by the time you get to the over 65s. So that's quite a shift. And what it means is that the online reviews versus professional reviews, you get a kind of crossover in that middle age band. that we're talking about, where they go from being very considerably different in one direction to being actually quite different in the other. So you get kind of an interesting shift there. So again, it matches what we were saying about the certain types of segments that tend to like one or the other, but there's definitely a bit of a skew towards online reviews being particularly important amongst younger age groups. Once you get above 45, that balance shifts. And one other thing, which I think is quite an interesting pattern, is that both professional reviews and stuff directly from cultural organisations actually rises at first and kind of up into the 20s and 30s. People seem to be a bit more trusting of those kind of official sources, and then they taper off. So that's again maybe kind of an interesting picture, and that maybe reflects something about sort of the greater focus on social and other sources below the age of about 25. So yes, there we are. So a bit of an interesting mix in terms of how people are engaged with different sources, what they engage with, why. And I'll pass over to Alec to do a few reflections on what that all might all mean. Okay. Oh, no, I won't. I'll talk to myself. I'll hand over to myself first, then I'll hand over to Alec. I beg your pardon. So, way of summary. A typical variety of social channels by segment. There's a tendency towards the higher engaged segments and older audiences to prefer professional reviews. A tendency for online reviews like TripAdvisor, etc., to be really important, particularly for younger groups, but important in general. The same people also tend to trust social. So it's really worth investing in making sure people are giving you it's good reviews. But also direct messages are well trusted, so it's not a case of having to rely on external third parties to kind of vouch for you. And if you want to find out more, Alec is as you saw from his job title, he's a consultant, and we can do a variety of digital consultancy. We've got various other colleagues doing that as well. We've got training programs, experimental programs about learning around digital, Let's Get Real, and various other research and analytics. Or indeed, if you see bits of this, you think, oh, I'd really like to delve into that in more detail, come and talk to us, because we can dive into splits by particular art forms or particular groups or particular places or whatever. And now I'll hand over to Alec.
Hi everyone. So for those who might have joined slightly late before I did my introduction, I'm Alec. I'm the consultant and lead for digital content and skills. And for a quick audio description of myself, I'm a white male in my early 30s. I've got dark brown hair, a beard, glasses, and a blue polo. So for just a little bit of information about my background, before sort of sharing some reflections, I used to work for a small museum in London in a sort of Marcoms position, but more so generally digital support. It was a small organization, so we didn't have a digital lead, and I was sort of known as the digital guy, which I'm sure some of you have worked in organizations where that's the case. After that role, I moved into the support sector, specializing in digital for museums, and then more broadly for cultural heritage, an organization called Culture 24, and we recently merged with the audience agency. So that's a little bit about my background. For some sort of reflections and thoughts on the findings from the CPM, I think the findings really are very reflective of changing habits and attitudes to sort of finding information online. So for instance, a trend that's happening at the moment is that more people are using social platforms as their core search engine, whereas traditionally people would use platforms like Google to ask questions. Increasingly, particularly younger people are using platforms like TikTok and Instagram as their sort of search engine, and so they're more used to getting their information and recommendations through different forms of content, often video content, compared to the sort of written content that older audiences like myself might be more used to in the internet era. There's some interesting research on that from Forbes, which we'll share some links to afterwards. So it's really not surprising to see that those who are sort of using Instagram and TikTok more are also using social media more to find things to do. And very much connected to that, as Ollie's highlighted, younger people tend to trust the people that they know on social media for recommendations of things to do. But then you sort of see that starts to drop quite significantly past the sort of 45-year-old and onwards age brackets. And I think these dropping trust levels are also sort of consistent for those unknown people online as well. So the sort of like others on social media, they tend to be the least trusted for recommendation on things to do across the board, which I think is quite interesting, considering the weight that we've often given word of mouth as a marketing tool. And that really does sort of correlate to the levels of age-related trends in digital literacy. So many older people are much more wary of people online, compared to younger people who are much more familiar with sort of talking to friends and strangers as well on digital platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and Discord, etc., as well as the more sort of traditional social media platforms. And Ofcom often publishes research into these sort of changing trends, and it's well worth keeping an eye on that, and particularly the sort of top level findings, not necessarily diving into the whole report every single time, but keeping an eye on those findings can be really useful. Another really interesting thing to consider that we haven't really covered in the CPM necessarily, but I think is super relevant, is the growth of AI generated content. A number of the social media platforms out there at the moment, LinkedIn as an example, now offer a feature for you to create posts using AI tools. And then there was the recent announcement just a couple of days ago that Apple have partnered with OpenAI. So ChatGPT is going to be a feature that is going to be much more prevalent in iPhones and Apple products going forward. So I think we're going to be seeing a really significant increase in AI generated content posted by the general public, sort of outside of those sort of specialists that might be using it more regularly at the moment. So if people are trusting social content that's created by peers or even strangers, how do they know that content has actually been generated by real people, or at least generated without the use of AI tools? And I think the same can very much be said for professional reviews as well. There's been a number of high profile publishers that have been caught out creating content using generative AI. And then there's the same for online reviews too. An example is that Amazon is creating AI written product review summaries. So they're using AI to summarize all of the user generated reviews for people. So I think it's really something to ponder in relation to sort of how we create our own content, how content about us is created. And YouGov recently conducted some research into the impact of AI generated content on trust in the news and journalism, and people really weren't positive about that. And I think that's going to be a trend that we're going to be seeing in the future, as more people have more access to these tools in their everyday lives. But thinking more generally about the sort of findings from this round, I think if I were in your position, I'd really be thinking about how I can apply these findings into my work and into my general practice, within the context of my organization and within the context of my audience as well. So thinking about some sort of top tips for things that you could do, I'd really want to be conducting some of my own audience research in line with these findings, to sort of test it against how my audience behaves and whether or not there's any sort of differences or similarities between what we found from the CPM. So you could look at things like visits that you receive on your website to key pages that might come directly from review platforms like TripAdvisor, as an example. To do that, you need to use UTMs, which are sort of trackable links, which not enough time to go into what that is and how that works today, but there's a really useful guide to UTMs from Buffer, which again we'll sort of share the link to, so you can do some research into that and how that might work with Google Analytics. You could also think about looking at which pages social media is driving traffic to. So you can sort of again take this further by setting up those tracking links to determine between your different social media campaigns to look at when you've given links to external parties, if you're working on collaborative projects like exhibitions or shows, and artists, for instance, might be creating content for you. You can see what sort of response that's generating for your audience versus the content that you're publishing more regularly. You could also look at how your audience engages with your social media content in general. How likely are they to share your content, to talk about it with friends and family? How are other people linking to your content from their own social media platforms? And is that something that you're monitoring and tracking? You could think about how you sort of track traffic that you might receive from key newspapers or magazines, particularly if you've had sort of reviews recently. And something that's really useful to do and not too complicated to do through Google Analytics is to create user journeys. And this is relevant for all of those points, but thinking about social media, for instance, you could track somebody who comes in from Facebook and then see what pages they land on, and then whether or not they purchase a ticket for your event or for your show. And you can see the sort of rate of people coming in and leaving, and that sort of conversion statistic. It sounds complicated, but there's some really good tutorials on YouTube, which are very simple to follow and can be really effective and useful. And then I think finally, I'd want to be conducting some more direct audience research of my own, thinking about simple surveys on my website or through social media or through newsletters, asking similar questions to the CPM. And the problem that I find with analytics is that it can only really get you so far. So if you want to get a real sense of sort of how people find your offer, the best way is to ask them directly, either in person or through online surveys, because as I said, analytics, you could look at your analytics and see that somebody's spending 2 minutes on a certain page. That could be because they're having a fantastic time and they're really liking the content. Could also be because the content's awful and they've not found the answer that they're looking for. So you sort of have to take analytics as it comes, data as it comes, and then sort of where you can augment that almost with more direct audience surveying. So those are my reflections, Ollie. You're muted.
So, thank you. Yes, I'm going to stop sharing, and if Megan could stop recording, then we'll